So I want to talk to you this morning about how it seems that Jesus does his best work with those who accept their vulnerability. Yeah. It's not usually the strong and the mighty who get Jesus to take action or that miracles tend to work. It's with those who accept their vulnerability and somehow expose it. And it's kind of curious that that happens. Now, I don't know about you, but I was never taught vulnerability. Have you ever been taught that? Like, here's how you develop your vulnerability. No one's ever taught me that. In fact, I think the opposite occurs. That what we do is we teach strength and we teach power and we teach, being always prepared, those kind of things. And we don't teach vulnerability as much. And so, in today's gospel, what we have is we have the famous Markan sandwich gospel, so you have like a story within a story. And so what you have here is you have the major story being Jairus, his daughter is dying. And then the minor story is you have a woman who has been suffering from hemorrhage for 12 years. She spent all her money on treatment and nothing actually has occurred. And so she thinks that if she can just touch the garment, she'll be healed. And she touches it and she is healed. And then we go back to the story of Jairus and the daughter. So it's perfectly bookended. And what we have is we have three characters, two of whom need healing and one who really wants his daughter healed. And they all have a need. And they're very similar in terms of having a need. They're very similar in meeting Jesus. And they're very similar in exposing their vulnerability, you see. Because what was it said? The leader of the synagogue throws himself at the feet of Jesus. So a really interesting way of showing vulnerability. Now, I can remember, in terms of vulnerability, I can remember a classmate of mine in my junior year of high school back in the seminary, the minor seminary. Now, we're talking 50 years ago. This is a long time, and I still remember this story. He had an aunt who he was very close to, and his aunt died. And so he was just devastated by that, and so he asked the powers to be if he could go to his aunt's funeral. But the rule was that you could only leave the seminary for the funerals of your mother, your father, any sibling, and your grandparents. Aunt was not covered, you see. And so he was forbidden to go. But he loved his aunt so much that he did whatever he could do in order to get to go. And so eventually they cracked a bit and allowed him to go to the wake one evening. But he had to be back the next day and couldn't stay for the funeral. So he told me that, and of course that was disappointing to him, but at least he got to see his aunt. So whenever he went to see his aunt, who he loved so dearly, he saw her laying in the casket and he just broke out in tears. And his uncle came over to him and said, "Joe, you have to be a man here. We have a lot of women who are going to be coming later and they're going to be crying, but you have to man up," you see. And every time I see this guy, that story comes up. So we're taught that strength, aren't we? So we're taught how to be strong, but not necessarily how to be vulnerable. See, that's not something that we get taught. And so it's really interesting how that all works, So that whole thing, don't let them see you sweat, Now, I'm not going to say that that's not the way to behave in certain circumstances, because I think in certain circumstances you have to display your strength. Like parents, don't you know that? I mean, there are certain times whenever you have to say, I am the boss, this is the way it is. That sometimes has to happen. In fact, it works best with people who believe like that too, like people who just believe that strength is the only way to operate out of power. It's sometimes really important for us to operate that way with them too. I had an interesting experience on Tuesday this past week. Katie wasn't here because her husband, for those of you who don't know, Katie is our receptionist, and she answers the phones all the time. And so her husband was having back surgery, so she was away on Tuesday, so I got to answer the phones. And so from time to time, I've answered the phones here at St. Brendan's since I've been here, and here's the way I would normally answer the phones. I go, "Good morning, this is Regis." No, I said, "No, good morning, this is St. Brendan's, this is Regis, may I help you?" Now, before I'm halfway through, half the people would hang up because I know they're not calling for me, they're calling for Katie, and so they just want to go. Now, those of you who are laughing, I know you're the ones, who do that, but I'm used to that. And so what I've learned is I learned to redo my opening pitch, and so it's, "Good morning, St. Brendan's." Okay, now, this call that I took on Tuesday, so, "Good morning, St. Brendan's. I want to talk to the pastor of this church." And I said, "Well, can I have your phone number?" And I'll make sure he gets it tomorrow, But he wasn't going to give me a phone number, and his name was Cleveland somebody or other. And so anyway, he just started on this incredible beating by using the sacred scriptures that I had ever heard. Like, unless you are saved, and this and that and the other thing, and I couldn't get a word in edgewise to him. And so, I just very patiently, which is my general approach, I just kind of said to him, but sir, Jesus was a good listener, and it doesn't seem like you are. But it just went on and on and on. So eventually I just said, I need you to stop. I just came in there, because I could do it if I need to, And so I just kind of made it very clear, and I matched strength with strength, and then we were able to have a little bit of a decent conversation. So I'm not going to say that you give that up, okay, because there's probably places where you need it, but I think we have to enhance our vulnerability, because one of the things we know from the scripture readings today is that it's in their vulnerability that those people have been able to be healed. You see, because they were at a place where they could get healed, So what is vulnerability? So let's just think about that for a minute. Vulnerability is one of my cousins who was divorced for 5 years, and last Saturday had the courage to go on her first date after divorce. That's vulnerability, isn't it? Just not knowing what's going to happen. Vulnerability is a story I heard about John Osteen. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. He's Joel's father, and he was a very popular preacher, and world-renowned. And he did a service, and his son Joel was the production person, and he had 7 of his friends in the production booth. And so after the service was over, Pastor John came into the production room and saw the 7, including Joel, were teasing and laughing and having a good time. And he went in there and he just laid them out cold, saying how irreverent you were, because he thought they were making fun of something in the service. How irreverent you were, you should act more like you're civilized people, and this is no way to conduct yourself, and this and the other thing. And Joel said to him, Daddy, we weren't talking about the service at all. We were talking about something else, but he just would not listen to that. Okay? And he just went on and laid them out. Well, at 11 o'clock that night, he drove over to his son's house, and he said, Joel, I have to apologize to you. He said, I was really out of line in doing this. And he made his apology and stuff like that. And then he says, can you also please give me all 7 of those friends of yours, because I have to do it immediately to them too. And he called each one and apologized. Now, this is interesting, because whenever you go and apologize, you have no guarantee that it's going to be accepted, right? Vulnerability. So what is it? Brene Brown. Have any of you ever heard that name, Brene Brown? That's a good name just to think about. You could probably remember Brene Brown. She has given one of the top 3 TED Talks in the world, and it's on the power of vulnerability, which is kind of interesting. And here's how she defines vulnerability. She says it's showing up despite feeling uncertain, at risk, and emotionally exposed without any guarantees. Yeah. It's being the first one in a relationship to say, I love you. You see? It's that moment of vulnerability, just not being sure what you're going to get in return. She went on to say that one time she was giving a talk to 1,000 people, and at that talk it was going to be signed. It was going to be signed. And so some of the signers met with her ahead of time and said to her, Dr. Brown, are there any words you use in particular that we need to kind of know ahead of time so that we can sign them appropriately? And she said, yeah, I use the word vulnerability a lot. And they said, oh, so here's how we would sign that. And they went like this. And she says, and what would that mean? And they said, your knees being knocked from you, And she says, oh, no, that's not what I mean by vulnerability at all. See, a lot of people think vulnerability is weakness, right? And the signer said to her, she said, well, Dr. Brown, there's only one other way that I think I can express it, and it's this. And she went like this. I'm opening my heart to you. She said, that's it. That's what it is. That's what vulnerability is opening your heart and taking the risks. Now, Dr. Brene Brown, she talks a lot about shame. And, shame is a feeling, and I would imagine everyone in this room felt shame, or at least felt guilt. The guilt and shame are not the same. Guilt is feeling bad because you did something. Okay, so guilt comes from doing something wrong. Shame comes from feeling you're wrong. See, there's a difference between the two. So of course, shame is a much more deeper thing that has to be taken care of often. And someone once said that whenever you get emotions, emotions are energies in motion. So why we get an emotion, what can be a helpful part of an emotion is that relying on your brain or your cognition to think about what you should do in a situation, you get a feeling, and the feeling pushes you to what you ought to be doing. Like, for example, if you get real angry, it's hard to think about, I need to have strength for this situation because something's going wrong and I need to be strong. Anger just produces strength for you, you see. And then our job is then to channel that, because left alone you can't figure all that out. Or, if for example you feel loneliness, then what that loneliness will do is produce a feeling of, I need to be seeing somebody, and it will take you out to do it. And so what is the emotion that shame tries to get us to do? It tries to get us to be vulnerable. See? So whenever you feel shame, that's your invitation to be vulnerable. And so what does that all mean? Well, because the greatest human need that we have is to be loved through a sense of feeling like you belong and you connect. See, that's the major thing that we need. That's the major thing you need in the community, is that when you come here, you belong and you connect. See, that's what love's all about. And shame, whenever we experience that, it tells us that there's scarcity around and that I'm not enough. See, I'm not good enough, I'm not wise enough, I'm not smart enough. And then if we do things that cause us to trigger our shame, the last thing we want to do is connect. See? And so that vulnerability gives us a chance to connect. See? And so, that's why, the 12-step programs are so helpful for some people, because they get to talk about the most shameful things that ever happened to them, and they still feel connected. See? Because people do not judge. And so, in a lot of situations that you feel shame, here's the antidote. The antidote is to be vulnerable and find someone you could talk to about it that accepts you. See? Because it's in those places then that you realize that you are connected. See? And that you count and that you're meaningful. See, our vulnerability is not weakness. Our vulnerability is the place by which we can see Jesus at work if we work with it. Perfectionism, intellectualizing, certainty are the armors that we use to protect ourselves from vulnerability. And so I think what we're invited today to do as we look at the gospel is that it's the vulnerable that get the healing. Not because Jesus can't heal all or God can't heal all, but they're the only ones that can take it in because of the position that they find themselves in. So, invite you to think about that. If there's something that makes you feel like you're not worthwhile, I pray that you find someone to talk to about that embraces you and allows you to know that you matter. Vulnerability can do incredible things for us. I heard a story, and this is the last thing I'd like to say about it, is this. About an Indian water bearer from years ago who lived in India. And so the way that he would go to get the water was he had this pole across his shoulders, and on one side a pot and on the other side of the pot. So they'd go over there and fill both pots up with water and then walk it over the half mile to the master's house. Now, the pot on the left was a perfect pot, and it carried the whole gallon of water all the way from the well to the master's house. But the pot on the right had a crack in it, and so it leaked. See, it was a bit vulnerable. It wasn't perfect. It leaked. And so as the journey of a half mile to the master's house would go, that crack cracked pot would lose a half of its water. Now, that went on for years and years and years. And so one day, the cracked pot, okay, now you're going to see this is not a true story, but it's just an analogy. The cracked pot had a chance to talk to the water bearer and says, I've been so ashamed of myself for 2 years that, that I would lose a half of the pot of water for you, and you cannot serve your master a full 2 gallons. I just want to apologize to you, and, I have just been so... And the water bearer said to this cracked pot, well, on our way back to the well, I want you just to observe the flowers. And so the next day came, and they walked back to the well, and sure enough, on the right-hand side of the path, there were flowers the whole way. And at the end of getting to the well, the crackpot says, those beautiful flowers, thank God for them, but I'm still feeling shameful. And the water bearer says, well, you know why those flowers are there, and if you notice, they're just on the right side, not on the left side. It's because I was aware of your flaw, and so I knew that you leaked water each time, but I threw wild flower seeds along the path, and you watered them the whole time. And so for the last 2 years, even though you didn't give me half a gallon of that water, you gave me flowers every day for the master's house. You see, God can do incredible things with our flaws. You don't have to hide them. Now, I'm not saying you don't have to put them in the little log either. We don't have to go public with things. But I pray that all of us has someone in our lives, or maybe a group in our lives, that whenever we are hurting, whenever we are vulnerable, that through them and our bravery with it, we can still find connection. Because it's on that level that we really understand what love is.